Hi, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I want to talk on this episode about the importance of drive and following your calling. Actually, I'm not going to be talking about the importance of drive. What I will be talking about is the challenge of drive. That was a bit of a setup. The reason I say that is because a lot of you are driven individuals, especially if you're listening to podcasts like mine. What most people don't realize about drive and being driven is how much it can actually set you up for problems and failure later on down. So I want to make sure that we at least touch on this topic and explore it in some detail, because I've seen a lot of trends when it comes to being driven and motivating yourself and doing everything you can to kind of almost psych yourself up into getting things done. But what's not being looked at is the problem with drive and motivation. So let's get into it. The issue with drive, if you think about the word drive, very much like maybe some of the cars you can hear in the background of this podcast, is that drive requires a motor. And motors typically require some kind of fuel source, something to keep them going. So if you think about a traditional motor in a car, they require fuel. They require gasoline or petrol to keep it going. Now, the challenge with that is it's a finite resource. You burn through it. And as you burn through the fuel source that you're using, you also require a top up, which is why a lot of people describe motivation as something that you need to, it's like a shower. It's something you need daily in order to keep yourself going. But where that whole concept falls apart for me and a lot of the people I've worked with is how you stay motivated, how you stay driven, especially on the days where you'd rather Netflix and chill, do everything else but get your work done and avoid all of the challenges that are in front of you. Now, there's a lot to be spoken about when it comes to willpower and essentially tricking yourself into getting things done and using different gratification processes to keep yourself accountable and getting things done. But I haven't found any of these different approaches to actually work when it comes to being sustainable. So what do we do? Well, instead of using drive, which requires constant fuel and refueling and topping up and continuing to basically put your foot down on the pedal, my preference is to focus on a calling or maybe an inspiration. And there's an interesting distinction between these two, being driven and being called to something. Because when you're focusing on being driven towards something, it's usually because it usually requires some kind of force, some kind of push. Whereas when you are called towards something, it's almost like you're being pulled into it. You're being drawn into it. Sometimes even against your own will, which is where people struggle with willpower. So for me, what I found was the harder I tried to push, the harder I tried to motivate myself, the harder I tried to stay driven, it created a lot of challenges for me. And there were many days where I wouldn't get stuff done because I wasn't driven enough, is what I was telling myself. And I would layer up on these judgments and I would shame myself and I would have this whole inner dialogue of beating myself up, not believing that I'm a genius and feeling like there was something wrong with me. But when I started to realize that maybe I was trying to push myself into things that I wasn't aligned with, then the pressure started to shift. Because that's ultimately what's usually happening with people. They're finding that if you're having to drive yourself and motivate yourself, it's because you're pushing yourself to do something you're not actually aligned with, or it's something that you're not seeing any value in. Sometimes that's the same thing, but there's subtle differences between the two. If it's something you're not aligned with, let's say you're inspired by fashion design. If you had to do accounting work, you would feel like you would need to drive yourself, motivate yourself, and psych yourself up to do all of the accounting. Now, that's an issue of alignment. You're not actually aligned with being an accountant, but you're trying to push yourself as a square peg into a round hole, and you will constantly feel frustrated by that. And you will constantly require topping up and refueling on the motivation and psyching yourself up. Whereas if you know that doing some of the accounting work in your fashion business is valuable and you start to see upsides to it, you're more likely to get it done. So the difference between seeing value in something as opposed to there being an alignment issue, it's subtle, but it definitely plays a role. Now, when it comes to finding the things that you're aligned with, you will find that you are actually naturally called to the things that inspire you. You are naturally drawn to them as opposed to driven to do them, as opposed to being driven to do them. You're called to them. In fact, they're things that you do even when you don't necessarily think you want to be doing them. What I mean by that is you can try and stop yourself from doing it, but you'll still find a way to do it. You'll still find a way to go and do that thing that you're called to. No matter how much you try to pull yourself away from it, it's almost like you can't help yourself. And for a lot of people, it is involuntary or unconscious. So my aim is to help you develop a conscious understanding and become consciously aware of what you are called to, what inspires you. Because when you become consciously aware of it, then you can start creating conscious intention to do more of it. And as a result of doing the things that inspire you, that you're called to, firstly, you'll go further in life, which ultimately we're all on this journey and we want to go far, especially if you're listening to this podcast. And secondly, that's where the fulfillment lies. If you're doing the things that you're inspired by, that you're called to, and you're actively working on them and consciously doing so, it's like somebody brings the color back into the picture all over again. So by finding your calling, you won't need to drive yourself. You won't need to motivate yourself. You'll just do it spontaneously, involuntarily. You're just boop, doing it. No one needs to psych you up. You don't require motivation. You don't need to sit there and think about what are all the upsides of me doing it. You will just do it without even thinking it. In fact, you are doing it. You just don't realize it. Now, why is it important that your calling is different to your drive? Well, because you're more likely to give up on the things that you're driven by or the things that you drive yourself to do, especially when things get tough. Think about how many different road trips you've been on or how many different car trips you've gone on and you've given up at some point and you've changed direction or you've changed your destination at the last minute or you've decided to stay home or just turn back and go home. When you're called towards something, you don't give up. You find ways to get it done because the act of fulfilling your calling is fulfilling in and of itself. What's also interesting about the difference between being motivated and inspired is inspiration. Like if you look at the word inspiration, inspire or spirit means the inner spirit or the breath, because the mystics of the past would refer to a parallel between breath and spirit. In fact, it was believed that the breath is what activated the spirit. And so the word inspire is almost like the inner spirit, the thing that inspires you from within, not externally. It's not some kind of external source. It's an internal source. It's an inner spirit or inspiration. Motivation requires external sources of energy. Either you going and looking for things that will motivate you to get something done, you leveraging certain pains to get yourself to do things, or certain incentives or pleasures as a way to get yourself to do stuff. When you're following an inspiration, it's something that you use internally that inspires you. Just the act of it, just acting on it, taking action, doing it little by little each day is what is inspiring and fulfilling in and of itself. So what I would love for you to do in order for you to get clear on what inspires you and what you're called towards, because there's a good chance that you might not know what that is look back through your past. And you can start with just the last 3 or 4 years. I know the pandemic has been difficult for people. Some people have gotten really clear on what inspires them. Some people feel like they've gotten completely out of tune with what inspires them. But have a look and you'll find even throughout various lockdowns, even throughout different experiences throughout the pandemic, there were things that you were drawn to doing, that you were kind of called to. Maybe they didn't make sense to you initially, but you just kind of leaned into them and you discovered a lot about that inspired you. So I want you to spend some time listing out all the different things throughout your life that you found you were naturally drawn to, naturally called to. They don't have to be things that look like a job or a job description or anything like that. Just an activity, or maybe a particular subject you found yourself really drawn to, or a certain category of YouTube videos that you kept reviewing, or different rabbit holes that you would go down that you were really you walked away from feeling energized as opposed to feeling drained and kind of depressed or heavy. That's also a clue. It's something that gives you energy. So as you go through this list, write out all the different things that you just loved doing as a child, as a young adult, as an adult, right up until the present day. And you will find that there is all these different things that you were naturally drawn to. Now, they may not make sense. They may also look like they're all very different from one another. But the next step to listing out all the things that you're called to is looking for the common thread amongst all of them. Because you will find that there is one common thread that runs through every single one of those things. So the best way to get clear on that is by asking yourself what it was about that activity or that subject, or why you were drawn to that. And if you go through and ask yourself the question of what was it about that? Why was I inspired by that? Why was I continually drawn to that? What did I love so much about that? As you continue to explore each of these different things that you're drawn to, that will start to reveal a bit of a common thread amongst them. And you will find that you might repeat yourself with the various activities throughout your life. That's fine. There's no issues with repetition. It's almost like we're kind of looking for that. We're looking for this consistency. Because what you will find is the thing that you're called to the most, you will continue to do no matter what. Nothing will get in the way of you fulfilling what you're called towards and what you're inspired by. So by going down through this list, you will start to see a common thread amongst all the different things you're referring to. If you see me looking down right now, it's because I'm looking down at a list of pretty much what I'm describing. So go through and list it all out, and you will find your inspirations were there the whole time. Then once you've gotten clear on what inspires you, what you're inspired by, and what you're called towards, I want you to spend some time answering the question, how can I do more of this each day? How can I do more of this thing that inspires me, or this thing that I'm called towards? How can I do more of that each day? And just little by little. You don't have to fill your whole day with it. That would be ideal, obviously. But you don't need to go from today discovering your inspiration and tomorrow spending all of your time doing that. But you can start introducing more of what inspires you each day. And as you do it little by little each day, if you think about where you'll be a year from now, if you think about where you'll be 2 or 3 years from now, if you do little by little each day, your life will look very different when you get there. And you will probably find that more of your day is filled with what inspires you and what you're called towards if you contribute little by little each day, and that builds up over a long period of time. And before you know it, you'll be unstoppable. You will be doing the thing that actually inspires you on a regular basis. And I couldn't think of anything that I would want more for you than to go and live a life that you're called to, that you're inspired by, that wakes you up, literally and metaphorically and physiologically. If you are in tune with and conscious of the things that inspire you, it gives you a new reason, a deeper reason, and a deeper meaning to wake up each morning. If you have a reason to get up each morning and get out of bed, you become an unstoppable force. And you will continue to reap rewards from doing so and orienting yourself towards the thing that inspires you. You will start to bring in more resources to help you fulfill that calling. You will draw in interesting people, people who want to help you fulfill that, people who want to be a part of that. But none of that happens without you first getting clear on what you're called to, and then asking yourself different ways that you can start to do more of that each day. You don't need to be driven. Leave driven and being driven, leave that for the people who need it, who aren't clear on what inspires them. For you, as a listener of this podcast, maybe a student of this work, I would love for you to follow a calling rather than experience being driven. And when you make that shift, you go from using a fuel source that you constantly need to top up, that requires all kinds of external motivation and external input, to using a fuel source that's sustainable, that comes from within, and it's renewable, and it just keeps sustaining you for most of your life, if not all of it. So don't be fooled by being driven. Driven is a really cool status symbol, but being called and inspired, that's for the masters. That's you. So I hope this episode was helpful and valuable for you. I really do hope that you do the exercises and dig deep on what inspires you and what you're called towards, and then start to work towards doing a little more of it each day. Now, if you've got any questions at all, make sure that you send me a DM on Instagram or shoot me an email. Also, make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you're listening to it, or if you're watching it on YouTube, make sure you've subscribed. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.